Greetings. In this presentation, we want to look at the servant of the Lord in Isaiah. Servant of the Lord, Eved Yahweh. Great phrase, and these are great chapters. The phrase itself just means one who serves the Lord. So it's applied to David, Moses, the prophets. That's a good phrase, and we want to ask then, what about these sections in Isaiah? Who is the servant? Well, is it Israel? Israel was called a servant throughout Isaiah, but this servant is obedient. Israel was rebellious, disobedient, didn't do what the Lord wanted. Could it be the prophet? Well, this servant is innocent. Isaiah was sinful. We saw that right away in chapter 6 in his call. In addition, this servant will be a light to the nations. Israel was a blind servant. The prophet was sent just to Israel. So we have an individual here who really is different than Israel or the prophet or anyone else. And that occurs in 4 chapters. There are 4 units here that we need to look at. In 42, we have the character of the servant. In 49, the call. 50, the obedience. And 52 and 3, the suffering of the servant. These have been called servant songs historically. Scholars talk about them and debate them, but most recognize that there's something very special going on in these 4 chapters. So we certainly want to look at them a little bit. And we begin with the first song, the character of the servant. This is an important section as it shows us that he was chosen and anointed by the Lord. 42:1 reads, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." So here you have the choice. The servant is anointed by the Lord, and he will bring forth justice. In this section, we see the character of the servant. We see what he's going to do, and he's going to establish justice in all the earth. And amazingly, he will open the eyes of the blind, verse 7. You can see when the Lord Jesus opened people's eyes, that drew attention to who he was and what he was doing. So we see that. The character of the servant we have presented in this section. We begin with 2 pictures that summarize his compassionate nature. The first one says, "A bruised reed he will not break." The reeds were used for a variety of things. They were used for papyrus, and there were many of them at the edge of water. So they chose the best. Any that was marred or bent, they would just snap off at the base. They didn't use it. But you could take it and bend it back up again and cultivate it, and it would grow fine, be usable. There's just so many of them, it wasn't worth doing. But this picture is that he won't break it off. He'll take the time to reestablish it. Same thing with an oil lamp. When it runs out of oil, it smokes. Easiest thing is to just snuff out the wick, add oil, light it again. But they didn't have matches in those days, so they had to add the oil and carefully fan the ember back into a flame. And both of these are pictures of the compassionate, patient ministry of the servant. In addition, you have 7 negatives in this section. Most English Bibles do not translate all the negatives, but they're there. He will not cry out. He will not raise his voice. He will not make his voice heard in the street. So you have 7 negatives. You can look at the list, but they characterize a quiet ministry. Matthew picks this up. Jesus had just healed the people, and then he tells them not to make him known. And Matthew looks at this and cites this passage in Isaiah and notes the gentle character of the ministry of the Lord. So the first servant song speaks about his calm character, his quiet, gentle character. The second song relates his call, that he really is a chosen individual. In chapter 49, verse 1, "The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, he named me." Verse 5, "The Lord formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob or Israel back to him in order that Israel might be gathered to him." So he was a called individual from his mother's womb, and that, of course, relates to the birth of the Lord Jesus. but he also represents Israel. In verse 3, he said to me, "You are my servant Israel." So Israel failed, was a blind servant, but this servant is called to do the will of the Lord and will succeed. So he is a type of Israel. He represents Israel, but he succeeds where Israel failed. His mission, of course, is to restore Israel. So verse 5 is important because Israel was not able to restore itself to the Lord. Israel couldn't restore Israel. But this servant will restore Israel and be a light to the nations. So that's a great ministry. So he's called to be a light to the nations. In the New Testament, Paul picks this up in preaching to the Gentiles. He starts by preaching to the Jews in the synagogue. They reject the message, so he takes the gospel to the Gentiles. And then he cites Isaiah and says, this is what Isaiah was talking about, a light to the nations. He does that in several places in his missionary journeys, affirming the fact that the gospel is going to the Gentiles. And he sees that as a fulfillment of what Isaiah spoke. So an important section here, the call of the servant of the Lord. The third, perhaps the best known one, is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. This is, for Christians, one of the best passages in Isaiah. Jewish people generally do not read Isaiah 53. It's skipped in their liturgy. When they do read it and discuss it, they see it as a personification of Israel. Israel is personified as suffering for the world. But it really is an individual, and many have noticed that clearly. And it begins in 52:13. Chapter divisions, you realize, were added very late into the Bible, and so some of them could have been in a little better place. And here's one. The thought actually begins at 52:13 and goes all the way through 53. So we start with the success of the servant. And it says 52:13, "Behold, my servant will prosper." That's a startling statement about his treatment. How he will be rejected and marred more than any man. But even so, he will prosper, he will succeed, and that's stated from the beginning. In 53:1-3, we begin with a rhetorical question. There really is no answer to this. Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? It's a rhetorical question, and it speaks of his rejection. The servant of the Lord will be rejected. John in chapter 12 and Paul in Romans 10 use this of Isaiah to show how Isaiah prophesied the rejection of the Messiah, the servant of the Lord. And so they apply that clearly to the rejection of the Lord Jesus, who, according to Isaiah 53, was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So this section speaks about his rejection. The next subsection is a substitute. His suffering is a substitute. This is a very dynamic and important section. People are like sheep. They're sinful. They're wandering around, doing their own thing without a shepherd. And verse 6 kind of portrays that. But the heart of this is the fact that he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Verse 5. What's amazing about this whole section is the alternation between the third person, what he did, and the first person, what he did for us. So you see that all the way through. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastisement of our well-being fell upon him. By his scourging, we are healed. So that alternation back and forth makes a very striking statement of what the Lord was doing. Matthew 8 applies this to the physical healing of Peter's mother-in-law. But Peter, 1 Peter 2, understands the greater application is the spiritual healing that sinners receive through the work of Christ. So there's a great statement here of the substitutionary atonement that the Lord provides for those who receive it. Then you have the suffering outlined in 7-9, verses 7-9. Talk about the suffering. He suffered silently. So we have a statement of that very clearly in the New Testament, that the Lord was silent. He could have debated or answered the accusations, but did not do that. So he suffered silently, and we see that in Isaiah as well, prophetically. He did not open his mouth. He died. He was brought to death. It says in verse 8, he was cut off out of the land of the living. So we have his death, and yet we have a hint of his sinlessness. There was no deceit found in his mouth. And as you look at the Lord, you see the testimony of his whole life was a sinless life. So this speaks of his suffering. And this passage is dramatically brought out in Acts 8, where the Ethiopian eunuch is riding along in his chariot reading Isaiah 53. He's reading this section. Isaiah actually says some very positive things about eunuchs in his book. So that probably attracted the Ethiopian, and he's reading this section and wonders, who is this speaking about? And Philip draws alongside of the chariot and leads him to Christ by pointing out that the passage was referring to the Messiah and not to the prophet. So this is a great illustration of how this is used. And 1 Peter 2:22, it relates this to the sinlessness of Christ, that he is our sinless substitute. So you have some strong use of this in the New Testament. We then have the accomplishment. Toward the end, we have the servants, the result, the accomplishment. And it says here the Lord was pleased to crush him. That's a strong statement. But a little further, it says the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand, using the same word. So the Lord wasn't enjoying or pleased to judge his son for us, but he was pleased with the outcome, the fact that it would be successful, the fact that Jews and Gentiles and anybody in the world can be provided salvation if they accept it through Christ. We also have a statement that he was cut off out of the land of the living. He died. And yet here we see that he's brought back. He sees his seed. So he's brought back to life again. So we have that resurrection kind of hinted at in verse 10. He'll see his offspring, prolong his days. And that's for the justification of people in verse 11. You have the justification. This is very important. Paul develops this in Romans 3:26, that God did this not only to justify us, but to do it in a just way. So God is not only the justifier of the sinner, he remains true, righteous, and just in doing it this way. He doesn't just slip us into heaven. He actually forgives us of our sin because a substitute died in our place. So the end of this is the exaltation of the servant to a position of honor and glory, and that's in great contrast to him being numbered with the transgressions. So we see a wonderful picture of the Lord Jesus here and what he did for us. If we wrap this up as a summary, in this whole section here, it anticipates how the Lord, the Redeemer, would save all people, Israel and the nations. Links a lot of the topics of Israel together. Israel was a blind servant, rejected God's provision. Idols are false. They couldn't do it. They couldn't predict this like Isaiah does. But God, as creator, is able to create the earth. He's able to do this plan. If he could raise up Cyrus and name him, he certainly could talk about the Messiah and then accomplish salvation for the world. So it's a wonderful section. These servant songs are dynamic and very important as we move forward in the study of Isaiah.